Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this fourth, I think, change agents, third change agents, and Still She Rises. We are going to be talking about the enduring power of the African goddess. And I actually have to correct myself. Dr. Rosalind Jeffries reminded us that Dr. Jacob Carruthers wanted us to call our figures divinities because God and goddess are European invented terms. So we are going to talk about the power of feminine African divinities. And we have Dr. Solange Ashby and Dr. Alisa Orduña, who, as you might have heard from me, are preeminent voices, experts, treading ground and breaking ground that has not been trod before. So I am just so excited to be in conversation with them. Wherever you may be, if you can just hold the original inhabitants of this land, wherever you are, in mind, and keep in mind that this land is stolen. Just as we as a people are stolen. But we are in the process of recouping, reclaiming. And we know that the power of the divine mother, the divine African mother, is leading that way, guiding us, and indeed will drag whoever does not choose to come willingly. So we thank the ancestors. We thank the original inhabitants of this land for being with us. We prepare ourselves for good speech and edification this afternoon. So I want to start with an unconventional nod to libation, a specifically African ceremony. I will be reading a short snippet from Solange's book, Calling Out to Isis, and then a short snippet from Alisa's book, Oshun's Calabash. So from Calling Out to Isis. Through the areas chosen by Nubians for their prayer inscriptions, we're able to ascertain the specific rituals that appeal to these priests and diplomats. It was the yearly reenactment and performance of the essential funerary rites for Osiris by Isis, the libationer. Both Egyptian goddesses, Isis and Nephthys, have an important role in these royal funerary chapels. Isis consistently is depicted standing behind the king with her wings spread protectively as she pours libation. Nephthys, too, is an important libationer in the funerary chapels. She performs a milk libation. Our official visit in Santiago, Cuba, was the Basilica of La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, a sacred shrine of Oshun. I opened my hands and bowed my head to pray. I could not think of any words to say, so I let the tears rise up and fall down. As I quietly wept, I felt a ray of warm and gentle energy shine down from the glass enclosed case of the Virgin encased on the altar. She began to embrace me. A voice simply said, "Let go. I can hold your pain." So I want you all to just, both of you to just introduce yourselves now that we have called in our three guiding forces, Isis or Aset, Nephthys or Nebet Hut or Nebet Het, and Oshun. So either of you can just jump in, just introduce yourself and tell us what called you to this goddess work, this feminine divinity work.
So I'm Solange Ashby. I have been studying ancient Egypt for a little over 20 years now, and certainly my entry point into the study is just a fascination with language. I love language, but I was really drawn to the hieroglyphic script because it is art and script at the same time. And that ended up being, unbeknownst to me 20 years ago, but it ended up being a central part of the analysis that I did for my dissertation. Looking at these Nubian prayer inscriptions and really seeing what type of imagery they were situated near in this temple of Isis, what the texts themselves said, the hieroglyphic text describing the scenes, and then what the prayer inscriptions written in a completely different script, what those said about what the worshipers were there to do. And one of the things that really stands out that makes the Nubian prayer inscriptions at this temple of Isis or Aset, right there at the border between Egypt to the north and Nubia to the south, the Nubian prayer inscriptions are just unending in their praise of the goddess. So she's known as the goddess of many names, and they talk about how she has dominion over the whole world, how she comes to help the one who is in need, how she can hear from far away. And so I was initially drawn to study Nubians because they were from further south and traveling to this sacred site. But I also love the way that they revered this really powerful mother goddess. And in fact, it reflected the prominence, the strength, and the centrality of women in Nubian culture in general. So all of those things together really brought me to this particular focus for my dissertation.
Thank you. That was amazing. I can't wait to read your work, and maybe now I'm like, I want to go there one day and visit and see the inscription. I think how did I enter this work? It was almost unconventional from an academic perspective. It was more of a spiritual calling, a spiritual unrest. And I would say after years of resisting and, learning the hard way that, when spirit calls you, you really can't run away from it. Finally re-entering it through dance. So through studying Afro-Cuban and Afro-Brazilian dance that were in honor of what we call the Orisha, which are energies of the world. So Oshun being affiliated with the rivers, the fresh water, the sweet water, Yemenja, in Nigeria, the river. Here in America is more the ocean, before we learn more and more about Orisha Olokun, etc. And dancing, feeling that vibration, like feeling something different than just turning on the radio and dancing. And so at the same time, had been working in the field of homelessness services for a number of years and starting to get burned out and just feeling like we're not ending homelessness. Like, we're not stopping people from falling into homelessness. There's something we're actually perpetuating in the design of the services and the program. So to get re-energized, went back to school to Pacifica, because I said, I need to find my voice. I need to know, what is my story in this work? And I'll never forget the first day of class. And one of my colleagues in our cohort, she said, "You're a priestess. Why are you hiding?" She said, "You walked into the room and all your ancestors walked in with you." And this was, mind you, after years of like, I'm not studying African traditional religion, I became Muslim, like the whole gamut, the opposite. And I was like, oh my God, she just outed me in the class on the first day. And of course, it was a Jungian archetype class. So not only did she call me out, but our professor said, invite those that are with you into the room. They're welcome here. And I was like, whoa, what? Okay, I'm in the right place. What does this mean? And long story short, followed through on what was it about the dance and fieldwork in Cuba. So the book that Dr. Sharon read from was a summary of my fieldwork experience, and learned how the Afro traditions, particularly from Yoruba, were retained in the culture through dance, music, ritual, and ceremony. And I'm like, well, if that could happen in Cuba, where is it in the United States? And so it was this parallel system of following my own spiritual path, but then saying, well, what does this mean for the world? How do we apply this spirituality? How do we counter the narrative of white supremacy and white ideology with our own belief systems and the impact and phenomena that are impacting our communities? What do our spiritualities tell us of what they are? And then how do we move through them? So that's how I was able to get here today and really focus my dissertation and looking at anti-Black biases in the homeless system here in Los Angeles, and coming up with this concept of Oshun consciousness as a methodology to move us out of homelessness and hopefully end it for Black people at some point. But you're on mute, Dr. Sharon.
See, duh. I think that's just to apply that whole lens onto such a, for lack of a better term, mundane thing as homelessness. You don't put those two things together. Homelessness seems so heavy and earthen bound, and to apply this concept of, African spirituality to it seems so foreign. And so that bringing that sort of holistic idea and practice to a very concrete, heavy sort of social issue is, I hate, to be trite, but really groundbreaking. And you can see where people might not understand the importance or significance. So, and Solange, with your work, from my limited readings, there is this fissure or this sort of hierarchy when we talk about Nubia versus Egypt. So for you to do that groundbreaking research also, it's fascinating, and it must be difficult. And that leads to my next sort of point. Have you experienced resistance to any of this? I mean, whether that's resistance within you, if you can elaborate on that, and resistance in the field, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, yes. But it's very interesting this last year with our sort of another cycle of racial reckoning that we seem to do every some decades here in the United States. Egyptology is having a moment, sort of kicking and screaming and fighting against the moment, but having a moment where they are looking around and saying, we are all white, we have zero diversity among our ranks, and oh my goodness, there's Nubia, and we've not put any energy into learning about this culture whatsoever. And so, yes, it's understating it to say I have experienced resistance. So I went to one of the foremost places to study Egyptology, University of Chicago, and they have in fact engaged in some of the most important excavations in Nubia. There's a basement full of treasures from this culture at the University of Chicago, such a small percentage of it on display, and yet they don't offer one single course about anything on Nubia. And this is not unique. It is, in fact, true, I would say, of every Egyptology program in the United States, and probably the many that are in Europe as well. And then just because for me, it was so important to write about Nubians from a Nubian vantage point and understand what I was seeing of their presence and activity in these Egyptian temples, but that happened to be situated in the land of Nubia, to understand what they were doing there as having agency and sort of picking and choosing what were the rites that were important to them, highlighting how they, in fact, kept these traditional religious practices going for centuries after the rest of Egypt had become Christian and the traditional temples had fallen into disuse. Just telling that whole story already was revolutionary. And yet, Dr. Alisa reminds me of something even more revolutionary in understanding this as a living spiritual tradition. That was a huge and very slow evolution for me, because within the discipline of Egyptology, as a scholar, it's pretty much forbidden to talk about this as a living spiritual practice or a tradition that has things that are of importance to spiritual seekers. When anybody from outside of the discipline will look at ancient Egypt and say, but it was all religion. But it really was and is still like considered very unprofessional, not objective, and unscholarly to talk about this as a living spiritual practice that might have something of importance, as I claim it, most specifically for women of African descent, that there's such a richness there and such an antiquity that turns the whole concept of white supremacy on its head, because we can see what is happening here in Egypt and in Nubia, both equally ancient, is happening millennia, multiple thousands of years between the Greece and Rome that white supremacists want to base their supremacy on. And so this is really revolutionary. And what it does by focusing on the worship of these African goddesses, and not only Isis, but Hathor, and then the Nubian goddesses, Amasemi and others, it just lets us know that we were sacred long before anything that white supremacy is trying to claim even came on the scene. So I'll just leave it at that.
Woo! Yeah. Alisa, how about you?
Yes, that was, my first thought was, okay, all the remains that are in that basement, how do we get them back home for reburial? Just to, that reconcile, but that's another conversation. No, I think it's so similar. I think when we understand from just a multicultural perspective that the divine feminine voice, was pretty much annihilated out of human consciousness, through the Enlightenment period, when the Europeans, Descartes, and, many of the other philosophers said, matter is dead. It's only the rational mind, and only the rational mind of a European man that can tell us any truths around the world. And I would have to say, Dr. Ed Casey, who was at Pacifica and taking his courses, and kind of in short summary, like really breaking down so many of the European philosophies, saying, now I understand what white supremacy is. It's not just Jim Crow. It's not just in the American concept, but colonization, that whole period was rooted in an emerging philosophy that centered on Europe and the dominance of Europe thinking. And it's saying, although that happened, and although it was put out through violence, there are other truths that still exist. There's other memory, there's story, like we're still here. Our beings were, eggs in our grandmother's, uterus or her ovaries, at some point. So that bloodline is really still there. And I think that's the part of the resistance that, for me, it came up around race in the homelessness field. I remember sharing, and asking questions around policy tables, of saying, well, why are there so many Black people on the street? Why is Black homelessness so prevalent? I grew up in Los Angeles, but went away to college, went away to grad school, was pretty much gone for 21 years and came back. So I miss the 1992 civil unrest, you know, after the Rodney King hearing. I miss the Northridge earthquake and so many historical moments that really fragmentized our community. And so being gone, like leaving at a point where, yes, we had so much gang violence. It was one of the reasons I wanted to leave, for safety. But at the same time, we had thriving Black communities. Then coming back, it was almost like a bomb what had been dropped literally on what I knew as the Black community. And all I saw were Black men pushing shopping carts in downtown LA, you know, and Black women every now and then, and wondering where they were, kind of peeping out of the encampment tents and working in the field, asking the question of why is this existing? And people are saying, well, you know, it's the criminal justice system. It's the war on drugs. And I was like, okay, these are all symptoms on par with something greater. Why aren't we going into looking at why are so many Black people entering into prison? What's the systemic biases that are leading us on these pathways into kind of institutionalization? You know, why are we being so segregated from society in this time? And I think that was the resistance of the feminine, because it was trying to figure it out almost from a masculine perspective. And also as a woman leader, really trying to figure out that, like the tension inside of saying, why is this so hard? Why am I leaving work so exhausted? Why do I want to cry when I get home? And how come, you know, when I say something in a meeting, no one's listening to me? It's like crickets. Everything is, I don't understand, or, you know, someone else repeats what you say and it's like, oh, that's so great. And it's like, well, I just said that, but how come no one validated that? And so there was this process of learning what it meant to be a feminine leader. And then what were those qualities if we were to take and apply and design solutions to it? And that was kind of that nexus to, we've got to bring back the feminine energy because we're out of balance. There's nothing wrong with a male balance, you know, male energy, but it's out of balance. You know, we have to bring the feminine and the masculine back in balance together. And I think that became the plight that I had to kind of over resist and bring that back. But it's been difficult, although you're right. I think right before even 2020 in the pandemic, there had been more talk about the goddess, and then a lot, I think, or sorry, the female divine feminine, I won't say goddess. But I think some people talked about it during the mandatory shutdowns, like this is a reset. Nature is regenerating, you know, the climate is getting better because we're at home and not polluting. And, you know, so people are making these connections between poverty and climate change and mass migrations and this idea of incarceration. So there's constant resistance, but I think at this point, maybe you just hit a certain age where you just don't care and you just realize that, what do I have to lose? You know, we have a lot to lose if I stay quiet, but what do we have to lose by not being quiet?
So that, and give me some, both of you actually. So you're talking about that balance, and I'm thinking even the divine feminine is balanced because Isis or Aset is the woman of the throne, and Nebet-Het or Nephthys is the woman of the home or the house or whatever. Solange, if you can tweak that. But even in that, and they work as a team, right? Osiris or Asar could not have been put together again without both of them hovering and as he, you know, sort of got put together again. So I don't know if there are any West African female deities that carry those. I know that in Catholicism, Our Lady of Charity is Oshun. But is there this sort of, you know, the feminine leader versus the feminine homemaker, Alisa?
Yeah, they're so in Yoruba culture, as I continue to learn it, so I don't want to say like coming from the expert, but as I learn it, women play a very powerful role. And so even a woman in the home may carry the type, like there's a title called Iyalode. And that's a woman within the community who is probably a sophisticated businesswoman, but she's also a wise counsel. So she's someone, if I'm a young mom, who do I turn to for advice? I may go to the Ialode. If there are ruptures in the community, they may go to the Ialode. There's also a concept called the Ogboni Society, and that is men and women, and that's like our form of justice. So instead of calling the police and going to jail, Ogboni is the one that makes sure violations against earth, which could be you don't murder, you don't, shed blood, you don't steal, like all the things to have good character. Ogboni is a society that kind of regulates, and they're often dominated by women. So there's this, it's not split. So like, even if you are the woman in the home, you are an Iya, and you may be in a Puete B, particularly if you're married to a priest or you carry just those additional responsibilities. It's multiple layers. And so there's a tremendous balance where the men honor their mother. We honor Mother Earth, number one, and then we honor the function of woman as the creator and the generator. And I think there's just this powerful story of just Oshun, I'll just tell it really quickly, found in Odu Oshetura, where Oshun was the only feminine energy that came down to earth in its creation. They're out of 401 male energies, only female, to talk about the power. And the male energies were kind of like, oh, we don't need her. She's just, a woman, whatever. She's off cooking, or she's off, doing whatever. And Oshun got offended. And she said, how come you're not consulting me on decisions about how do we create this society? And they just continued to ignore her. So she said, okay, fine. I'm going back to heaven. And so she went back up to Orun, and all of a sudden life stopped. The crops stopped growing. They turned to dust. Rain stopped falling. Women started miscarrying and not having babies. So all the things to regenerate life and the beauty and the aesthetics that make life rich and the rich tapestry dried up. So they go to Olodumare and like, we're making sacrifice. We're doing this. We're doing what you told. What happened? And he said, where's Oshun? Where's the one woman that you need to talk to? And, they went. And so the whole thing was they just recognized Olodumare commanded women must be present at all decision-making and all building of the foundation of community. So there's this, from our cosmology perspective, I love Baba Mason, who says, women, it's men and women in balance, but women have just a little bit extra, in that balance. And that's just something that I think is so true in Yoruba society, and it often gets misrepresented, and it can be mistranslated or may have evolved in different ways, particularly with the onset of Christianity and European colonization and patriarchy. But traditional Yoruba women are very powerful, but the performance of womanhood, if you will, is different than the West. Power doesn't mean you have a loud voice. It doesn't mean that you're dominating a room. It means it's your presence and the function that you do in society and the advice that you give.
That's great. Solange, are there any Nubian or Egyptian comparisons, that balance of, female as leader and consultant, as well as nurturer and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. So much of what Alisa was saying, I'm shaking my head. Yes, that's exactly it. So I'll just use, I guess, first the example that you mentioned, Sharon, about Isis and Nephthys being two sisters who are working together and literally physically surrounding Osiris as they are bringing him back to life through their power. And right, one being associated with the throne being that seat, literally the seat of power, and the other being much more associated with the temple or the home sphere. And I've had sort of people, Egyptologists even, who are coming at this concept saying, yeah, but this is just sort of valuing women for their reproductive abilities. That's sexist. And I said, no, in the African context, that is the seat of a woman's power, that she is the one who is bringing forth life. And so we see that in this Meroitic period, the kingdom of Kush, about 300 BC to 300 AD, there are really powerful soul ruling queens. But she gets her initial power because she is that royal sister. She is the one who's going to birth the next ruler. And it can come from a variety of her offspring. So it could be a daughter who can be the next soul ruling queen, or it can be one of her sons who's chosen. So she, in her very own body, is both the power of the ruler, the soul ruler, and the power of the mother, who is continuing this royal line. And it's not only limited to the royal sphere. Just even today, Nubian people still use terms in their language. I'm thinking of Nobeen, a living Nubian language. Kinship terms are, who are you in relation to the mother? And I saw this in my prayer inscriptions from antiquity. It is all about, I'm performing my rites here before my daughter. I'm bringing donations to support the priest and the priestly daughters. I'm here, I'm praying for the well-being and the safety of my mother. And so even though the entire corpus was written by men, and you might think patriarchy, no, women are everywhere woven into it. And so to interpret that correctly, we need to use an African concept of gender and how much more fluid that is, and how the woman can be both the homemaker, the queen of her castle, the mother, but also that very powerful presence on the council of elders who are making decisions.
I could add some, you said something, Dr. Solange. I forgot, when we do our prayers in Yoruba and Orisha, it's all like if I were to pray for you, I would ask your mother's name. And so you would be Omo, child of, regardless if you were male or female, but that's how we pray. And so even when I was going through my initiation, I was Omodora. I wasn't Alisa. I was always, Omodora, Omodora, Omodora. So it is beautiful that through line throughout, it seems like throughout the continent, of that connection to that mother lineage. Powerful.
Can I just jump in and tag off of that? So there's
absolutely
a Nubian woman. I only know her through, online. I'm really looking forward to meeting her, but she told me she's Nubian from Egypt. She's married to a non-Nubian Egyptian man. And she said out in the world, their daughter is known by his last name, like we do here in the West. But when she goes back to her ancestral village, her daughter is known by whatever her first name is, daughter of Mena. So she takes her mother as her matronymic, if you will, like that's her identifier. And so I love that.
Wow. So going a little, well, it's related. Years ago, I remember having a dream, and I just heard a voice say, "There goes Allison," talking about me. And my mother's name is Alice. And so I got chills hearing you say that, because Spirit was identifying me in that African way. I am the child of Alice, right? So, I got chills. But that brings me to my next segue into the next question. So apparently, with these examples that you're giving, in African traditions, women in society, as a, I guess, reflection of the divine energies, they're multifaceted, multi-powered. And if we are identified by our mother, by relationship to our mother, that strikes a chord in me, because I'm thinking of Christianity, where this whole convoluted genealogy of Jesus goes back to Joseph, who wasn't even his real father. And I said, no, you should be doing Mary's lineage, not Joseph's. I remember a different catechism. I remember that there was much more to read about Mary and her childhood, and that, Jesus was not an anomaly, because Mary had these divine qualities as well. I remember reading a piece about, when Mary or Marie was a little girl, and they sent her to school, And she didn't just walk up the stairs, she kind of levitated up the stairs. And I'm like, okay, so number one, where is that book? Where is also that her sister Elizabeth, or whatever Elizabeth's actual indigenous name was, they were educated women. And so can you identify all of that to say, can you identify a moment historically where that shift happened, where the focus suddenly became on men and masculinity and patriarchy? Obviously, there were remnants of this divine feminine in Christianity, and suddenly it was gone. So in your studies of these various African divinities, is there a moment where you said, I see what you're doing? Can you identify a moment when that shift happened and the erasure started to happen?
I think there are multiple moments. In terms of Christianity, really specifically to me, Paul is just the enemy. I'm just gonna say it. That dude was not a friend of women.
I am not arguing. I agree.
The majority of the books in the Bible are written really from his point of view. He has stamped his misogyny, I'm just going to call it that, all over the book and the religion. But if you will indulge me, I'm going to take it back even before there was Christianity, because we see even in Egyptian traditional religion, in the Old Kingdom, so 2600 to like 2200 BCE, there were priestesses who were holding official temple positions and performing cult actions and leading worship. But we see over time, like even down to 1900, 1800 BCE, that women are starting to get shuffled out of these traditional positions of power within the religious structures in Egypt. It is different in Nubia. So further deeper into the African continent, we see women remaining really important, and even in now the political realm, increasing the amount of power that they're holding. So we see kind of a schism going on in these Nile Valley civilizations, where Egypt is kind of becoming more male dominated, and Kush is remaining very much in balance between the masculine and the feminine. And that's why I was like, I gotta go with the Nubians.
Oh, I gotta go with the Nubians. Sorry. Oh, that's funny. Alisa, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think there were multiple points, and trying to think of specifics. I think of it in a couple ways. One, I definitely think the period of colonization. So Europeans entering into particularly West Africa at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And even though at that point there were, in Yoruba language, Oba is king, but king is not gender specific. So there were female Obas, there were female Iyalodes, who were these like powerful businesswomen, negotiators, who all, it's a dark side of history, but who were part of those conversations from a trade perspective. I'll put it that way. And it feels like as we left, and as societies weakened and kind of reconfigured, that's when there was more of a change to patriarchy. And I would even say for us in that period of the journey, from the continent of Africa into the Americas, we still retain an understanding of gender and respect for the women. And I think you could see it in the foundations that we created, from healers, naturopath and the grandmother, the role grandmothers in Black families, the role of that elder council in traditional Black churches before the onset of evangelicalism that kind of just whitewashed everything and whitewashed our history. And the other part I would say is something in that northern migration, when we moved away from the land and that connection to the land into an urban concretized environment, very siloed and very segregated, I think that's when we started to shift away from divine feminine traditions, because that was country, that was looked down upon. When we moved to the city, we're much more sophisticated. Instead of, tending our own herb garden where we had medicinal plants and knew what they were, it was like, no, go to the local pharmacy, like everything white became better. And I think in that internalization of trying to assimilate into what we thought was a sophisticated society, we actually went backwards in losing our connection to land, our connection to mother, and the balance of the gender. And then if you just look at, even as we have strived toward our liberation, the feminine is not always present. When we think of the Black radical tradition, or we think of some of the Nation of Islam, when we think of other pieces, and I get it, because slavery had a traumatic impact, I'm sure, on gender identity, particularly among our men. If you can't protect your woman and your child, your girl child, I can't even imagine the psychic breaks that happens with that. And so I could see it, catapulting to the other extreme, where you're super dominant and super protective to the point of erasure of the feminine just in your household, let alone within your community. So, and I think the narratives that have been co-opted outside of us. So even when we talk about Martin Luther King, you talk about Malcolm X, you talk about even the Black Panthers, the role of women in the retelling of those stories has also been erased or silenced. And so it's hard to say, we were there, Septima Clark and, Ella Baker. They were running camps to help voter educate. Like, there wouldn't be a king without a Rosa Parks and an Ella Baker and a Septima Clark and all those other African-American women that were holding it down. But how history is retold, their stories were like, oh, Rosa Parks was just tired on a bus one day. And it's like, no, that is not even the real story. So somehow it's like to uncover this and to give our Black men and our Black communities space, I think, to re-identify. I guess it's almost like offering cultural frameworks of how to look at our situation differently. How do you look at it, what I call the white gaze? How do we turn away from that and go back, retrieve these indigenous value systems? And if we look at society, even as messed up or whatever it feels like it is right now, if we re-look at it from a different cultural lens, what would we be seeing, and how can we re-teach our eyes to see the divine feminine that never left us?
So again, perfect segue.
I just have to say, she's starting to speak now, so just to let you know.
Oh, so, you're bringing in these sort of historical examples of how the divine feminine has maybe been, or not maybe, definitely has been quashed. So symbolism versus historical reality. Do you have any take or insight on that? Were these deities, were they at one point real people or based on real people? Or are they just symbols? And if they are symbols or energies, how can they be incorporated better into our historical realities?
So in Yoruba, yeah. So in the cosmology, there is a level of hierarchy. So there's energy that we call Orumile, which are more pure, primordial kind of energies that came into the earth and habitat, if you will, in various aspects of nature. So they're not like Shango is not lightning, Oshun is not the river, but where they manifest on earth and how you can understand their attributes and their character, we identify them with these different forms of nature. Over time, though, and with other what we call Orisha, these were living people. And I love Dr. Iya Funlayo Woods, who always says, don't get it twisted. Orisha practice can be practiced by anyone, but when we talk about the Orisha, these were African people. These were people, Yoruba or Nupe or just other Igbo or I'm forgetting all the different ethnic groups that are in the area, but these are real people and multiple people. So you may hear of like different roads of Oshun, and what that could be are different people that had attributes of what we assign to this kind of energy of Oshun, and it kind of gets added on like layers of a story. So kind of like a griot telling that life history. So it's people that have done extraordinary things in their lifetime. Maybe they prevented a war, maybe they saved babies from dying, maybe they, I don't know, invented a new crop or something with the economic system. Because those events were so significant in the history of the people, and we come from oral traditions, they're added on to the mythology. And so you're like, wow, how is Oshun, you know, she was talking to people in the, I don't know, 1000s, and she was talking to people in the 1800s, and she's over here in the United States in New York in a botanica, like, who is this person? And, you know, it's because these are living histories, these are living energies, and energies adapt. Energy doesn't die. And so it's very malleable and adaptable. And so when we honor these traditions, I guess saying that it's so important to honor the African roots of these traditions, that even if even if you're practicing in Mexico, even if you're practicing Lukumi in Cuba, or the Church of Shango, the Shekere Church in Trinidad, wherever, we always have to honor the African roots. And that's been an issue sometimes in the adaptation. And so and it doesn't make the lineage kind of quote unquote pure from Nigeria different than what was retained in Cuba. It's an honoring and knowing that these are expansive traditions and expansive mythologies. And to me, a beautiful piece would be like, how did it cross the ocean into the Americas? And how did people retain what they could of these traditions and of the rituals and of the literary corpus of the Odu and all that? And how do we add that to what also was happening in Nigeria? So now one book, instead of it, let's say, having 100 verses, it may now have 5,000 verses, because we've added all the pieces of how this energy manifested and what it did to advance and protect and nurture, you know, our communities.
So when you're saying that Oshun, for example, is manifesting in I'm understanding in different people, so that we can understand that they're actual historical people who are then embodying the goddess. Did I understand you right?
Yeah, there are. So Oshun is a primordial energy, but over time, as she has manifested in different of, let's say, her daughters or priestesses or people that have carried her energy, the contributions that they have made to society, instead of it saying like, oh, Alisa did XYZ, you know, 100 years later, it'll be like, Oshun did XYZ. So it gets somehow absorbed or metabolized into the mythology of Oshun. And it's almost like, and it's not offensive, you know, it's like you're living your life, because we strive, if I can not have to come back to earth. So in our cosmology, you make a agreement before you come to earth, and you make an agreement in heaven of what your destiny is. If I can fulfill my destiny so greatly, I don't have to come back to earth. We look at that as like an elevation to the status of being an Orisha. But instead of not necessarily Alisa as an Orisha, whatever deeds I did here on earth would be attributed to the legacy of Oshun. So in the mythology of Oshun, people are like, yes, Oshun works on homelessness, you know, or something like that. But that's how these primordial energies have become expansive and almost relevant for us today. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I love that. And I was asking for clarification because Some people who are doing research in Egypt are starting now. So of course, women scholars starting now to look at these women that we're becoming aware of who are covered in tattoos. And so really symbolic of Hathor, for example, who has all kinds of qualities to her. But the way now that these very few forward-thinking women scholars are describing this as priestesses who are embodying the goddess. And this sounds a lot like what you're talking about in the Yoruba tradition. And I like it because it is understanding women's roles, and probably also men, but I'm interested here in the women who I just mentioned sort of get pushed out of the priesthood. So this particular woman I'm thinking of doesn't have any sort of written texts that claim her to be a priestess of Hathor, but she seems to be a medicine woman. And Hathor is associated with childbirth, so she probably was a healthcare practitioner. She worked with women, helping them to deliver and all of that. So that was sort of along me thinking out loud, but the Egyptian stories tell us at least the god Osiris was way, way, way back in earliest times lived and ruled as the first king in Egypt. But outside of that, we're to understand the other divinities as not being involved in the human sphere. They are, as you said, sort of manifestations of parts of nature. Not that they are, you know, the Nile River or the storm cloud or whatever, but we see their power touching our lives through these various entities. But I guess the final thing that I'll just say is that Isis and Nephthys are very much connected with mourners because of their role in finding and then mummifying and preparing Osiris for burial. And so we have texts that tell us that specifically young girls would take on this identity as either Isis or Nephthys to serve as mourners in funerary rites. And so this is another way to look at it, that a young female could embody a goddess in performing these rites. But I don't think for the Egyptians, any of their divinities were understood as having formerly lived on the earth. Although that's something I'm still grappling with because, as you may have been reading between the lines, my training has been very European centered. And now I am trying to come at all of this profound knowledge I have with new eyes, with African eyes, if you will.
I just want, there were two things you just said. Real quick. One, another example that I think is more clear is Shango, who is a masculine deity or energy, but Shango is also the king of the Oyo people. And there were several Shangos, and that's a clear one where it's like, here's this energetic force, but because the power of the Oyo Empire and its legacy, like the lives of those king stories have been embodied into the mythology of Shango himself and the Shango cult. The other part, I think, what's so can be scary if you look at Hollywood, you know, but what to me is so empowering and beautiful about these traditions is the fact that they are living energies that we can embody. So we won't, you know, open a whole nother door around the whole phenomena of like spiritual possession, but just the ability of understanding the attributes and either striving for it, or, you know, how sometimes like grandmothers look at a baby that's born and like, oh, that child's going to have this temperament, you know. So if we can again have a cultural framework to know, oh, that temperament's related to Isis, or this temperament is related to Oshun, or, you know, any of the other deities, we start to understand who they are and possibly, and it's more complex but ritual about what's their destiny here on earth. So how as a community can we support them? So if this is going to be a sensitive child, as a community, how do we not judge that child and say, toughen up, but we say, let's support this person's path, and vice versa. And the healing part is when we know that there's a source of energy inside of us. To me, you can deal with so much in the world. So the concept of the mourner, of someone embodying that, instead of like physically absorbing the grief, or that could turn into illness inside of you, knowing that there's like this energy that's a protective fabric inside that is allowing you to be present for this grieving family, but also be this kind of Scotch guard, if you will, or absorbent, so it doesn't impact your personal spirit. It's like, I don't know, to me, it's like this expansive way of being in the world without constriction, where we can hold community for each other and be present for each other in a very different way, that it's almost counterintuitive to some of the European ways of being in the world. So that's what makes it healing, is that this ability to expand without harming ourselves, and this kind of natural regenerative piece, kind of like that rebirth, is that these energies really can take stuff out of us, take harm, take trauma, take deep emotions that could lead to mental illness, take that out of us. And I think that's just so important once we really understand the cosmologies of them.
So that, again, perfect segue. So in the event flyer or photo, I referred to both of you as scholar priestesses. Where do you see in your lives that you are becoming or embodying or expressing or adding to the characteristics of one of the feminine deities? Do you see yourself in that way as a priestess? And which one, which deity or deities do you in your work feel you are sort of carrying on that legacy?
I will take a stab at that, Sharon. I remember this pivotal moment where one of my colleagues, and I don't know if you know him, he's also in Southern California, Salim Faraji, right? He called me and
I don't know him personally, but we were connected.
Yeah. He called me in an email, Hari Heb Aset, which in Egyptian means the priestess of Isis. And I thought, ooh, because I mentioned before, like, it's just so verboten to even be at all spiritual about this knowledge that we're getting in academia. But that was so empowering for me. I like literally felt this bolt, and I thought, oh, that's such a different way to understand these decades of knowledge that I've been doing. Might be more like an initiation into a state of being a priestess. But part of my evolution as well has had me switch my focus, my energy, and my adoration more from Isis to Hathor. And that certainly came through writing this paper studying about these Nubian women who were serving as priestesses, dancers, and musicians in the worship of this very powerful goddess Het-Heru, she's called in the Egyptian. So she's the temple or the enclosure of the god Horus, who is that manifested as the king sitting on the throne. And this has really taken me down a whole other path, because now I want to know who were these particular Nubian women who were serving as priestesses with their tattoos and cowrie shell belts and really explicit, powerful female sexuality and dance. And then this concept of divine drunkenness that is both drinking spiked beer, but also the spiritual drunkenness that we get when we make that divine encounter. And perhaps we're being ridden by the divinity, right? And so embodying Het-Heru. And so these women come from this amazing tradition. We don't know much about them because they didn't bother with writing. They didn't construct really expensive, fancy temples. They were topless, wore beautiful worked leather skirts, cowrie shell belts, a lot of gold because Nubia is the land of gold, and they were much more egalitarian than either the Egyptians to the north or those powerful Kushites to the south. And we call them, Egyptologists call them the C group, which just says we don't know anything about these people, including what they called themselves. But I love that this is, we see from their burial goods and their lack of monumental structures that this is a very egalitarian society. It was not about accumulating wealth and power. They were cattle herding people. And so the goddess Hathor, Het-Heru, as a cow-headed goddess, probably is the Egyptian idea of whatever their indigenous goddess was. There's just so much to love about these women. And I'm thinking I'm more interested in researching and writing about them than I am per se about these queens of Kush, who they were badasses, they were warrior queens, they had amazing bling for their jewelry. But I love these nomadic cattle herding women from this egalitarian society who were all about the music, the dance, and the power of female sexuality.
Oh yes, you have to write, you have to find them. That is going to be amazing. Oh my God. Yeah. And also, yes, ISIS and all of them are calling you. So just go with it. Just, yeah. You know, it's I've been initiated into, I like to say the mysteries of Oshun. I think it's only been 2 years. So to me, it's not comfortable saying the priesthood because there's so much to learn around divination, the medicines, the prayers, the songs, what to do in certain situations. So it's like initiation to me is this just rebirth onto this pathway. And so it's too premature to call it priestess, but how I see kind of it showing up in my work is not giving up on humanity. And I would have to say, if I look back and had an honest conversation of what led me down the PhD route or the doctorate route, and why was it so important to taking time out to find my voice, it's because I kind of felt as a Black community in the US, as with ties or, you know, direct descendancy to those that experienced enslavement here in the US in particular, that we were dying out, that we were almost in like a state of hospice care. You know, when it was that time around the police shootings, and there were these real public acts of death by suicide, or just a lot of sadness and trauma, you know, a collective grief that was kind of really bubbling up. And I just, you know, found myself saying, are we, and part of it was I had gone through hospice with my mom. So I lost my mom too. So that metaphor was very clear to me. And when you watch your mom pass, make those transitions, and I was seeing kind of similar kind of indicators like in society, it made me very sad. And I said, are we at that last leg, or is there a possibility for rebirth, and what would that take? So that kind of was the catalyst for all of that. So where Oshun shows up is not letting me give up on humanity, and saying that kind of like my litmus test of anything that seeks to divide society is anti-human. And how do we reclaim this kind of balance back in with nature? How do you build solidarity? It's not so much to me the identity politics, but it's like, what are you protecting? So if it's the water keepers, or if it's, you know, people fighting for housing, you know, for everybody, or if it's people fighting, advocating for, to reduce Black infant mortality and Black maternal mortality, like whatever it is, if it's for humanity, how do you support it, and how do you build those bridges among coalitions? And then how do we enter in self-care so these advocates don't get burned out and don't get bitter to the point where even though they started off for humanity, now they're almost anti-humanity, you know, or that narcissism kind of kicks in. So it's been deep, you know, and I think that's what sometimes is exhausting a little bit, because it feels like it's hard to come out the depth. Like Oshun is the river, and sometimes I feel like I'm always underwater. So how do you rise up above the water? But that'll just be a process.
What do you think these divine African feminine energies are trying to teach us today?
I will just say pretty much what Alisa just ended with, right? To not give up on humanity, that we are also divine, that we have that spark and that energy. That's what is causing us to live and not be a corpse, that divinity that is within us right now. And then also from the Nile Valley tradition, that everything needs to be in balance, that if we're seeing as they did the world as a duality, that the male and female can be in balance, that the upper and lower can be in balance, that that we are just to seek balance. And that is called Ma'at in Egyptian, and it just means divine right order, that there is a way that we are to be in this world, and we're not in that right now. We are so much in Isfet, which is just chaos and the opposite of divine right order. And I think that these feminine spirits, the divinities, these powers are just urging us to get right with ourselves, with our communities, with our earth. That is this is it. We don't have a second backup planet. And so just,
even though we think we do, Mars and no, this is it.
It's just not, it is just not it. So we just need to get in alignment with our mother, which is this one precious earth that we have.
Ashe, definitely, I agree. And I would add this. So Ifa, one of the strongest tenements, if you will, of it is that you build character, and that in unlike some of the other traditions, that we have free will. So again, it's like, you know, we made an agreement in heaven to come to earth and fulfill a destiny. But humans have autonomy, that we are, when you're able to ground yourself and tap into that divine spirit, you have autonomy and you have free choice. We're not sheep that has to follow the herd, and that there has to be this deep awakening around the culture that we live in, and being able to see the edges of it, that it is a culture, and that there's a culture within us, and many of us, our indigenous brothers and sisters, our Latinx, our Asian American, you know, you name it, that there's so many cultures that if people just spent the time, you know, I always say, just start interviewing your grandparents and really understanding the cultures and your ancestral lineages and the cultures that surrounded them, and then amplify that against what you're seeing in your day-to-day. Are you out of alignment? Why is the walls of your home kind of the boundaries between culture and your cultural values and the outside world? And which are you striving to be? It's like the outside world is making us sick. We need to recognize that we're autonomous beings with divine power and divine will, and that we can start making choices. We can, I love, it's Hegel, and then, you know, how Fanon really, to me, cultivate the concept that, you know, in that master slave kind of binary, or the white black binary, you can break it. You know, if you had a triangle and you had the line and everything's in symmetry looking at each other, what happens when you just turn away? It's time for us to turn away. It's time for us to break symmetry with the mythology that is not working for us as a human species. And I believe something new is going to emerge, but I believe it is like Sankofa. There's a piece that we have to go back and reclaim the pre-colonial, to understand that different value systems and different gender roles or identities and all existed before, to give us some new ingredients and some new tools to forge forward with that kind of new culture or way of being that as we evolve consciously is that the earth is even asking us to create.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so this is from Deborah Wright. What are some of the ways to promote the divine feminine in the day African diaspora and in our daily lives that impacts the consciousness of our institutions, our youth, in ways that can impact fragile egos of some men, especially as domestic violence, rape, sex trafficking claims so much of our possible power, so much of the possible power of our communities? That's part one. So let me just reiterate. What are some of the ways to promote the divine feminine in the modern day African diaspora and in our daily lives? And do you feel that we should promote as a working tool divine feminine over or as a replacement for feminism?
I would say yes to all of that. The divine feminine is so much richer, wider, and more ancient than feminism. And feminism really is just sort of a reaction against patriarchy and masculine domination. But what the divine feminine gives us is so much more. It's not just a rejection of patriarchy, but it is a whole ancient, deep, and complex spiritual way of being in the world that I think a lot of people have never even heard of. So I think even just getting the knowledge out there that this is a thing, and then most importantly about perhaps a way to bring on board more fragile male egos is to present it as this is our heritage. This is who we are. And now that we are here interacting in this capitalistic, patriarchal, colonization, settler, all the bad things, we have been so fully colonized that one first step, a potential way to reject that mental colonization is to understand that we come from a very different tradition, and that tradition respects and centers women. And so looking back in that Sankofa way to reclaim that heritage is a very powerful way to liberate our minds, our hearts, and our spirits. And that can be just something as simple as respecting women and understanding that this is traditional for us. And if we want to be macho men and beating and attacking and raping women, that is part of a damaged, colonized mind and spirit. And so what more powerful than to say, no more of that. We need to heal our communities. And as Alisa said, just turn away from that. And this isn't even traditional for Europe way back when, but it is part of the European colonization and domination. And we need to just say no, because it's not working for any of us.
And I would add to that there's healing that has to take place. And again, I think we have tools. Like when I think of the fragile male ego, I kind of don't think, as women, I think we stand on the outside of that circle to support, but men who are in balance with their own feminine energy, not femininity, but their own divine feminine energy that is just within as a human being, that energy that allows you to cry, that energy that allows you to be intimate, that energy that allows you to respect your mother, that energy, and men who are in balance like that need to be leading that circle with other men. And as women, we stand out on the outside, but I think that has to be within that circle. And the other part, I think, to help build, again, that protective factor is when I do exercises sometimes, and, I get all excited. I'm like, okay, I'm going to present, Yoruba perspective and honoring the mother. And I've been in circles where I've asked people to, do something related to their mother, and the amount of tears and anger that comes out because relationships with mothers are so fractured, even within our community, where mom isn't mother, she's a bitch, or she's this, or they don't even know their grandmother's name. I'm like, whoa, it's not, your grandmother's probably still living down the block somewhere. How do you not know her name or where she grew up or any of that? And so I think so much healing has to take place. And I think our egos have to get out of the way. And we just have to say, if we are committed to the future of our own generations, those ovaries that are inside of us right now, whatever commitment we have to them, we've got to just, take the Band-Aid off and have some anesthetic and just move forward with the healing so that we can get to those other places to even absorb our African heritage. There's just so much, fragmentation and pain and loss of intimacy where we have absorbed that everything is material and everything is disposable. You don't like what I say, that's fine. I'm going to dispose you as a human being from ever talking to you. What is it? Gaslighting and I don't know, cancel culture and all those kind of terminologies. And, no, not everything is like a potato chip bag. We should stop buying the small potato chip bags, but that's a whole nother piece. But it's those pieces. And I agree on the feminism. I've always had trouble with that word because I come from a long lineage of strong Black women, from stories of great grandmothers to my grandmothers to, of course, to my mom, and then extended kinship family was always surrounded by strong Black women. So the label of feminism didn't quite make sense. It's like, isn't she just isn't she just a Black woman? Is she just a woman? And I agree, divine feminine is so different because it's not about, it's not replacing the current hierarchy with another hierarchy. It's around being in balance. And that even in, Jungian ideology is that we have to have, the balance with the anima and the animus, even regardless of what sex you were born with. Again, we both have feminine and masculine energies, not people or identities, but energies within us. And that's what we have to strive for, which is what bringing back this awakening of the divine feminine gets us to.
So this is part of the Isis erotology. And erotology, again, anybody who's Catholic knows, during certain high holy days, they'll read a litany. So either the litany of the saints, or there'll be, a litany of names for Yeshua, Jesus, or a litany of names for Mary. And so an erotology is a poetic literary form where the characteristics of the divinity are listed and read. So again, this is the part of a temple hymn. Some people might know it as Thunder Perfect Mind, but this is the Isis erotology. And I actually read this at my commencement ceremony in 2012. So, awake in peace. You yourself beautifully awake in peace. I am the great mother, queen of the sky, mistress of the gods. I give you all life and all power, all health and all joy. I give you the power of heaven and creation. I give you all of the land and all lands. I come to those who reflect upon me, and I am found among those who seek me. You who are waiting for me, take me to yourselves, and do not banish me from your sight. Do not be ignorant of me, for I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the barren one, and many are my children. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am the voice whose sound is manifold, and the word whose appearance is multiple. I am the utterance of my name. I am shame and boldness. I am strength and I am fear. I am war and peace. I am the one who is disgraced and the great one. Give heed to my poverty and my wealth. For many are the pleasant forms which exist in numerous sins and incontinences and disgraceful passions and fleeting pleasures which my children embrace until they become sober and go up to their resting place. And they will find me there, and they will live, and they shall not die again. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you, Alisa. Thank you, Solange. Everyone have a good day, and go forth and embrace the divine African feminine energies within all of us. Thank you.
Ashe, thank you.
Ashe. Thank
Dr.
you. Thank
Sharon,
you.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Beautiful.